Francis Nelson had been turned away from 9 compounds in 20 days, and 9 times the response was the same. Silence, a hand resting near a concealed holster, and the gate sliding shut. She had learned to keep her real trade unspoken. Saying an intelligence analyst made dangerous men look twice, wondering if she carried a wire or a target on her back. So she let the encrypted drive stay buried at the bottom of her kit bag, swallowed her pedigree, and asked for whatever dirty labor needed doing with 2 hands. Her cash was down to copper, and another night out in the hills was a risk she could no longer afford to take. If you're the kind of person who roots for the quiet ones, the ones everyone underestimates until it costs them everything, you're going to want to stick around for this one. Hit subscribe and join everyone else here who loves watching an underdog prove exactly what they're made of. Now, back to Francis. The Gallo estate sat high above the tree line, cut in pale stone and ringed by heavy iron. Marino Gallo was perched on the hood of his black sports coupe in the midday sun, inked wrists resting on his knees, watching a delivery slip flutter in the dry wind. Flanking the drive, 6 men in dark suits kept their carbines low, while his head of security paced the perimeter steps like an overseer calculating dead weight. The heavy gate ground opened. Francis walked straight through the gap, a battered leather suitcase in one hand, a sack slung over her shoulder, her coat worn through at the seams. She knelt in the dust with open hands, tired around the jaw, holding herself like someone who knew exactly where the sniper lines fell. "Sir," she said, looking straight past the iron to the man in the car, "wondering if you have honest work that needs doing." "What kind?" Marino asked, his voice low and level. "Scrubbing, carrying, clearing, hauling, whatever keeps the house clean." Marino studied her from under dark brows, the way a boss inspects an unmanifested crate left on his tarmac. "And if I tell my men to throw you back down the road?" Francis didn't flinch. Her gaze stayed dead even with his. "Then I keep walking. I just need food and a place to sleep." She said it flat, like an inventory count, not a prayer for mercy. Marino didn't move from the car hood. He didn't offer sympathy, and he made that clear right there in the gravel. If she worked, she ate. 3 days on probation to see if she was an asset or dead weight. Simple rations, a bare room off the basement generator passage, and ordinary scullery labor. Nothing inside the perimeter office, and nothing that required a single ounce of unearned trust. The room they gave her sat directly below the main floor pantry, 4 paces deep, with concrete floors that stayed damp, and a narrow cot pushed against the load-bearing wall. The house manager, a stern woman named Teresa, who spoke only in short directives, dropped a pair of stiff gray work aprons and a bucket of coarse bristles onto the thin mattress. A guard named Luca stood in the doorframe the entire time, arms folded across his chest, the grip of his sidearm visible beneath his dark suit coat. Francis didn't ask about the lock on the outside of the door, nor did she complain about the hum of the auxiliary generator vibrating through the stone. She washed her face in cold water, tied her hair back with a piece of twine, and reported to the rear scullery before the clock struck 1. Her assignment was the ground floor corridors, endless stretches of polished marble, high baseboards, and the heavy service passages that connected the main kitchen to the private dining rooms. To anyone watching, she was merely another exhausted transient bent double over a bucket of lye and warm water, hands reddened by the scrub brush. Behind her downcast eyes, Francis was building a grid. Every stroke of the brush was timed to the footsteps echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The front portico maintained 2 sentries who rotated on the quarter hour, but their relief consistently arrived 40 seconds late from the south gatehouse, leaving the eastern colonnade entirely unmonitored for nearly a full minute. Overhead, the dome cameras swept in smooth 80-degree arcs, but the massive floral archways on the north terrace cast a 3-meter blind pocket directly beneath the study balcony, a lethal dead zone for anyone attempting an unauthorized ascent. She counted the men by their tread and the subtle rustle of Kevlar. 6 on the outer perimeter, 4 sweeping the interior corridors, two stationed permanently at the double oak doors leading to Marino's private wing. They were disciplined, but they were predictable. They moved like men accustomed to being feared, rather than men expecting an attack. By late afternoon, Francis had memorized the full schematic of the lower compound. The thick reinforced firewalls, the heavy iron vents that fed fresh air from the hillside, and the primary electrical conduit running exposed above the dry storage larder. Marino Gallo passed her once around 4 o'clock, walking beside his head of security. His polished black Oxford stopped inches from her bucket. Francis kept her head down, her cloth working in steady, unbroken circles against the stone. "She caused any trouble?" Marino asked, his voice smooth and disinterested. "Hasn't said 2 words all day, boss," Luca answered from the corner. "Just scrubs." Marino lingered for a second longer, the shadow of his tailored frame falling across the wet floor, before walking toward the courtyard without another word. Francis dipped her brush back into the gray water, watching his reflection ripple in the suds. She had 80 hours left to prove she was worth her keep, but as she listened to the uneven cadence of the guard changes shifting for the evening watch, she knew the cracks in Marino's fortress were running far deeper than the dirt on his floors. The study smelled of rich cedar, tobacco, and cold iron. Francis was permitted inside only under the direct supervision of Dante, Marino's chief enforcer, a hulking man with silver-threaded temples and a perpetual squint that treated every shadow like a threat. He leaned against the heavy mahogany mantel, scrolling through an encrypted tablet, barely glancing at Francis as she polished the brass runners along the library wall. Her movements remained rhythmic and unhurried. Cloth, wax, sweep. But her focus was locked 2 feet to her left, where a single-page shipping manifest lay face-up beside an open lockbox on the central desk. It was a freight invoice for a crate of Austrian-made tactical sidearms due at the South Docks before midnight. To an untrained eye, the columns of figures looked routine. The gross tonnage was marked, the seal numbers aligned, and the carrier company was a shell firm Marino had used for years. Then Francis's gaze caught the tear weight. She wiped down the desk's edge with deliberate slowness, eyes tracing the numbers once more. The manifest listed 50 units of polymer frame pistols, but the total crate weight exceeded the standard payload margin by nearly 30 kilograms. Furthermore, the routing number carried a 3-digit suffix specific to deep-water customs checkpoints, an inspection protocol no private smuggler would touch unless the crate had already been flagged and tracked by a rival outfit or a tactical squad. It was not a shipment. It was a tracer crate designed to pin Marino's convoy in place at the docks. Francis didn't gasp. She didn't run for the door. She finished buffing the edge of the desk, folded her rag into a neat square, and stepped back toward the door where Dante stood. "Sir," she said quietly, keeping her chin angled toward the parquet floor. Dante didn't look up from his screen. "Finish the wainscoting and get back down to the larder." "The dock ran at midnight," Francis said, her voice even, unhurried, and stripped of panic. "Your third crate carries an extra 65 pounds of ballast and a maritime secondary code on line 4. Dante froze. The room went dead still, except for the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. He lowered the tablet, his eyes fixing on the ragged woman in the gray apron, with sudden, lethal intensity. "What did you just say?" "Polymer frames don't tip the scale at 8 pounds a box," Francis said, meeting his hard gaze without the slightest tremor. "And you don't route private cargo through Dock Bay 7 unless you want 2 chase vehicles waiting behind the crane. You send men to that pier tonight. You aren't picking up hardware. You're walking into an interdiction." Dante stepped forward, towering over her, his hand twitching instinctively toward his left lapel. "Who the hell are you?" "The maid," Francis replied simply. "And your 3-day grace won't mean much if your crew gets boxed in before dawn." Dante stared at her for 5 brutal seconds, searching her face for fear, deceit, or a smirk. Finding only cold, flat certainty, he snatched the manifest off the mahogany top, his jaw tight. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode toward Marino's private chambers, leaving Francis alone in the quiet room to finish her floor. By noon the following day, word of the cancelled dock run had rippled quietly through the compound. The convoy hadn't rolled, and a surveillance drone sent to Pier 7 had spotted two unmarked tactical vans waiting in the shadows of the cranes, just as Frances had predicted. No one spoke of it to her, but the glances from the sentries were no longer dismissive. They were watchful, laced with uneasy curiosity. Frances remained in her fraying apron, focused entirely on the estate's domestic underbelly. The back service corridor, where the kitchen took daily deliveries of produce, meat, and dry goods, was an operational mess. A pair of heavy industrial refrigeration units and a tall stack of dry storage bins had been positioned beside the reinforced double doors, creating an acute dogleg turn. Every vendor, delivery hand, and kitchen porter carrying a heavy crate was forced into a tight, blind 90-degree corner where incoming traffic met outgoing footpaths. More critically, Frances recognized the architectural vulnerability. Anyone coming through the service doors with an assault weapon would have direct, unmonitored hard cover behind the cooling units before the security monitors down the hall could register a breach. Without asking, Frances went to work between the morning vegetable delivery and the afternoon meat drop. Using a heavy iron hand truck and the steady leverage of someone used to moving field gear, she hauled the empty steel wire shelving 6 feet down the tiled hall, wedging it flush against the concrete partition. Next, she shifted the dry bins into the recess near the laundry chute, clearing the central arterial path entirely. The hallway opened up into a straight, clean sightline from the reinforced exit, straight to the security camera at the corridor's apex. The roar of boots on tile broke the quiet before she could finish wiping the baseboards. Marco, the estate's short-tempered chief of internal security, rounded the corner with 2 guards at his back. He stopped dead in the middle of the newly cleared floor, his face darkening as he looked at the rearranged crates. "Who touched this?" Marco snapped, his hand resting on his service weapon. He locked eyes with Frances, who was kneeling with a scrub bucket. You moved this equipment?" "The corner was choked," Frances said evenly, standing up and wiping her wet hands on her apron. "The porters were taking 3 minutes per pallet just to clear the bend. You are a stray off the gravel, brought in to clean scum off the floor." Marco stepped directly into her personal space, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous rasp. "You don't touch property. You don't redesign my perimeter corridors. You cross that line again, and I'll throw you out the front gates myself." "Marco." The low voice cut through the corridor like a steel blade. Marino Gallo was standing at the entrance to the wine passage, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, an unlit cigar between his inked fingers. He hadn't made a sound approaching. Marco straightened immediately. "Boss, she's reorganizing the service line without authorization. It's a breach of—" "Look down the hall," Marino interrupted quietly. Marco blinked, hesitating. Marino stepped into the center of the corridor, his sharp, dark eyes measuring the distance. He looked from the exterior service hatch, straight down the unbroken line of sight to the overhead camera, and then to the defensible choke point Frances had created against the load-bearing pillar. "If 3 men breached that door with carbines," Marino said, his gaze shifting to Frances with cold, razor-sharp assessment. "Where does the camera see them now?" Marco went rigid. "Immediately, boss. No cover within 20 feet. Marino tapped the cigar against his palm, looking at the ragged woman in the gray apron. She didn't look proud. She didn't look afraid. She just looked competent. "Leave the bins where she put them," Marino said softly. He looked at Frances for 3 long seconds. "Get back to work." The air inside the estate turned suffocating by late afternoon. A black envelope had been delivered to the front gate at 2 o'clock, brought in under heavy guard. Lorenzo Rossi, the ruthless syndicate leader controlling the eastern freight corridors, had formally demanded a neutral sit-down for the following evening at the old rail yard crossing. Everyone in the Gallo house knew what a Rossi invitation meant. It was an ultimatum wrapped in courtesy, designed to force Marino into ceding his southern transport lines or ignite a city-wide war. The mansion's private dining hall had been cleared of staff, but the door remained slightly ajar as Marino, Dante, and Marco argued around the long table. Maps were spread across the polished walnut, but the tension was thick, frayed, and indecisive. Marco was pushing for a heavily armed 12-man escort. Dante argued that bringing that much iron to a neutral sit-down would trigger an immediate firefight before words were even exchanged. Down the hall in the adjoining pantry, Frances was polishing the heavy silver serving platters. She worked in complete silence, but her hands were doing far more than drying silverware. Across the long stainless steel prep counter, she had laid out a meticulous, geometric arrangement. A salt shaker sat at the center of the metal surface, flanked by 3 polished dinner knives pointing outward like converging avenues. 4 brass napkin rings formed a staggered perimeter around a heavy pepper mill, while a bent dessert fork was wedged under a serving spoon to represent an elevated grade. Footsteps stopped at the pantry threshold. Marino stood in the doorway, his jacket discarded, tie loosened, sleeves rolled to mid-forearm, revealing the sharp ink tracing his tendons. He had come to fetch water, but his eyes locked onto the stainless steel counter. He didn't speak. He simply stepped inside, closing the heavy pantry door behind him with a soft click. Frances didn't scramble to clear the counter. She kept her polishing cloth in her hands and stood at parade rest, meeting his gaze. Marino walked slowly toward the counter, looking down at the silverware. He recognized the topography instantly. "The rail yard crossing. The salt is your vehicle," Marino said, his voice flat, testing her. "Your vehicle and your 2 chase cars," Frances corrected quietly. "And the pepper mill is Rossi's delegation parked under the south crane." Marino pointed a manicured finger at the 2 brass rings sitting isolated near the edge of the sink. "And these?" "His sniper overwatch on the abandoned grain silos," Frances said, her tone cold and matter-of-fact. "If Marco drives your convoy in through the primary access road along the knife blade, you enter an 80-yard kill funnel with 0 lateral egress. Rossi doesn't want a negotiation, Mr. Gallo. He chose the rail yard because the embankment to the west cuts off your radio relays and leaves your tail car boxed between the retaining wall and the train tracks." Marino stared at the knives, the salt shaker, and the bent fork. The sheer tactical accuracy was chilling. His own security chief hadn't factored in the radio interference from the concrete grain elevators, yet this woman had mapped the terrain using pantry supplies. He looked up, his dark eyes boring into hers. The illusion of the harmless drifter was entirely gone. "Who the hell trained you, Frances?" Marino asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marino led her not to the basement, but up the private spiral staircase into his private study. He locked the heavy double doors behind them, walked to the bar, and poured 2 fingers of amber bourbon into a crystal tumbler. He didn't offer her a glass. He simply leaned against the edge of his mahogany desk, the tumbler resting in his scarred, inked hand, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "Sit," he commanded. Frances didn't sit. She remained standing near the center of the Persian rug, feet shoulder-width apart, hands resting behind her back, an ingrained, unshakable stance of quiet readiness. 24 hours ago, you intercepted an interdiction on my supply lines," Marino said, his voice dangerously low. 10 minutes ago, you broke down a syndicate kill box using kitchen silverware. A drifter begging for scraps doesn't calculate ballistic trajectories from an abandoned grain silo. Give me the truth, Frances, because if you're a federal asset or Rossi's plant, you don't walk out of this room. Frances didn't blink. She held his gaze with the unflinching steadiness of someone who had looked down far colder barrels than his. 8 years with a joint special operations task force, she said, her voice smooth, level, and entirely stripped of the weary facade she had worn at the gate. Senior logistics and intelligence handler, I ran covert supply corridors, asset extractions, and counter-surveillance grids across 3 continents. I was the person who made sure 40 men entered a hostile zone, accomplished the objective, and came home without leaving a trace. Marino took a slow sip of bourbon, his expression unreadable. And how does an asset like that end up at my gate with torn boots and $20 in her pocket? A supply manifest went missing in Berlin, Frances answered, a flicker of hard steel cutting through her tone. 200 high-grade military rifles and 3 million in untraceable bearer bonds vanished from a secure depot. My director needed a scapegoat to cover his own offshore accounts. My name was signed to the authorization codes. Within 12 hours, my clearance was revoked, my pension burned, and a Black Ops retrieval team was given a burn notice on my head. She paused, looking around the opulent room. I didn't come to your gates to infiltrate you, Mr. Gallo. I came because the people hunting me don't operate in syndicate territory. They look for clean hotels and bus stations, not fortified estates run by men who shoot first and ask questions never. You gave me 3 days of shelter and food without asking for my identity. That makes you the only person in 4 weeks who hasn't tried to put a bullet in my back. If you've ever felt like Francis in that moment, underestimated, hiding who you really are, waiting for someone to finally see you clearly, drop a comment below and let me know. This community's built on stories like hers, and I'd love to hear yours. All right, back to the estate. Marino set the crystal glass down on the desk with a soft clink. He stepped closer, towering over her, studying the sharp intelligence and utter lack of fear etched into her tired face. If Rossi strikes tomorrow night, Marino said quietly, my family bleeds. Can you counter his grid? Francis met his eyes dead on. Give me the comms frequency, your men's deployment route, and 72 hours of authority. I won't just keep your family alive, Mr. Gallo. I'll dismantle him. The transition happened without a formal announcement, but the shift inside the compound was absolute. Before midnight, Marino called Dante and Marco into the private operations room beneath the West Wing. He didn't explain Francis's dossier, nor did he invite debate. He simply leaned over the architectural blueprints and gave a single, unyielding directive. Whatever alterations she marks on this layout, you implement. No questions. No pushback. Marco's jaw clenched, veins bulging along his neck, but a single glance from Marino silenced the protest in his throat. Dante merely nodded, his seasoned eyes flicking to Francis with a newfound, calculating deference. Francis shed the gray apron, stepping up to the blueprint table in a dark, fitted sweater and work trousers supplied from the estate's tactical stores. Her presence commanded the room before she even spoke. Rossi won't hit the rail yard sit-down, Francis began, her finger tracing the North Estate Road on the map. He called the meeting as a distraction, to draw your primary security detail and heavy vehicles away from this house. He knows your family, your ledgers, and your command corps stay behind these walls. She reached into her pocket, producing a black marker, and began slicing red lines through the estate's existing defense perimeter. First, your patrol rotations are scrap. You stagger the outer sentry shifts to 9-minute, non-linear sweeps, no synchronized handoffs. Keep the south gate dark. Cut the floodlights entirely. If Rossi sends a probe team, make them think our auxiliary generator failed. Marco leaned forward, his voice tight. Cutting the lights creates a 40-yard blind run. It creates an invitation into a crossfire, Francis corrected without looking up. Station 2, 2-man rifle teams on the roof of the carriage house, suppressed, zeroed at 60 yards. When Rossi's breachers exploit the dark, they aren't slipping through, they're walking into an interlocking kill zone. Next, she moved to the internal layout, recalibrating the estate's evacuation routes. She decommissioned the standard eastern egress corridor, noting it was too exposed to tree-line snipers, and converted the subterranean wine cellar into a primary tactical redoubt and secondary hardpoint. She designated the service passage she had cleared earlier as the main resupply corridor, staging crates of ammunition, medical kits, and night vision optics along the newly cleared alcoves. Every blind spot she had catalogued while scrubbing the marble was turned into an ambush pocket. Every surveillance dead zone was rigged with tripwire acoustic sensors. By 3 in the morning, the mansion had ceased to be an ostentatious display of wealth. Under Francis's quiet, ruthless precision, the Gallo estate had been transformed into a lethal fortress. Marino stood by the door, watching her work the comms frequencies and map out the extraction vectors with absolute mastery. If Rossi's vanguard moves before dawn, Dante asked, looking directly at Francis for the first time, where do we set the primary line? Francis capped the marker and looked up, her gaze steady, cold, and clear. Let them breach the outer gate, she said softly. We close the box from the inside. At 0200 hours, the storm broke over the valley, and the estate's power grid went dead. Emergency circuits failed to kick in. Rossi's infiltrators had severed the main lines at the perimeter junction, plunging the mansion into pitch-black shadow, punctuated only by flashes of lightning. Outside, the screech of metal tore through the rain as a reinforced SUV smashed through the darkened south gate, followed by 2 tactical vans, disgorging a dozen heavily armed breachers. Suppressed automatic fire erupted instantly along the driveway. Inside the main foyer, Marino and Marco were pinned behind the massive marble staircase, deafened by the splintering of wood and shattered crystal as high-caliber rounds chewed through the grand entryway. Rossi's vanguard was pouring through the shattered terrace doors, cutting off Marino's path to the inner armory. "Comms are jammed!" Marco shouted over the roar of gunfire, ducking as plaster rained onto his shoulders. "We're cut off from the carriage house." Then the secondary radio channel, the auxiliary VHF frequency Francis had hardwired earlier, crackled to life inside their earpieces. "They aren't jamming the low band." Francis's voice cut through the static, cool, rhythmic, and razor-sharp. "Hold your position, Marino. Do not push the foyer. Marco, suppress the terrace door for 5 seconds on my mark. 3, 2, 1, fire." Marco leaned out, emptying a burst into the smoke. "Carriage team," Francis's voice commanded across the grid, tracking the heat signatures from the security bunker's battery-powered infrared feeds. "Target the terrace threshold. Suppress at knee level. Sweep right." From the carriage house roof, the 2 snipers opened fire with synchronized, heavy-caliber precision. Through the rain, the rounds punched cleanly through the terrace masonry, collapsing Rossi's flank and severing the assault line into 2 isolated pockets. "Dante," Francis directed without a pause, her voice an anchor in the chaos. "The second team is pushing the service corridor to flank the foyer. Fall back to the larder pinch point. Do not engage until they clear the refrigeration alcove." Dante didn't question her. He signaled his men, pulling them deep into the reinforced hallway she had reorganized that morning. 3 breachers rushed around the straight corner with tactical rifles raised, expecting the blind dogleg that used to be there, only to find themselves trapped in a wide-open, 60-foot sightline with 0 cover. "Dante, light them up," Francis said, the hallway lit with muzzle flashes. In less than 6 seconds, Rossi's secondary squad was eliminated. "Marino," Francis came back on the line, her tone dropping to an icy cadence. "The remaining 4 breachers are retreating back to the south driveway. They think the dark is their exfil route. Redoubt team, illuminate the floodlights now." The carriage house triggered the auxiliary batteries, blasting blinding white light directly into the courtyard. Caught in the sudden glare, Rossi's survivors had nowhere to run. Marino stepped through the shattered front doors, his weapon raised, flanked by Dante's unit, cutting down the final assault before the engines of the getaway vehicles could turn over. Silence fell over the compound, broken only by the hiss of rain on smoking brass. Marino lowered his smoking gun, chest heaving, his dark eyes looking up toward the illuminated second-story operations room. Standing by the rain-streaked window, headset resting on her collar, Francis looked down at the courtyard she had just saved. The pre-dawn mist mixed with the acrid stench of cordite and burning rubber as the estate began its grim recovery. Floodlights hummed, casting long, stark shadows across the limestone courtyard where Rossi's assault had been systematically crushed. Inside the grand foyer, the marble floor was littered with shattered crystal, spent brass casings, and chipped stone. Francis walked down the central staircase, the radio headset now hanging loosely around her neck. She had changed into clean clothes, but the cold, analytical focus in her eyes hadn't wavered. At the base of the stairs, 3 of Marino's senior lieutenants stood waiting. Luca, who had once stood over her like a prison warden, while she scrubbed the larder, was holding a pair of confiscated military-grade radios and a blood-stained tablet. He didn't bark orders, and he didn't glance toward Marino's private office. He stepped forward, his head lowered in an unmistakable posture of deference, and held out the hardware directly to Frances. "Ma'am," Luca said, his voice subdued and tight with genuine respect. "We pulled these encrypted transceivers from the lead breacher. The signal frequency is still pinging a secondary repeater in the eastern hills. Should we jam the uplink or monitor the chatter?" Frances didn't hesitate. She glanced at the frequency readouts. "Keep it open. Patch the feed into the bunker's recording rig. If Rossi realizes his forward squad is dead, he burns his safe houses. Let him think the feed is just lagging." "Understood," Luca replied, turning instantly to execute the directive. To her left, Dante approached, his charcoal jacket torn at the shoulder, carrying a tactical manifest of the captured weapons and the zip-tied survivors held in the carriage house. "We took 2 breachers alive," Dante reported, addressing Frances first, his eyes flicking to Marino only as a matter of formality. "Marco wants to put them in the wine cellar for interrogation right now. Do we move them or leave them separated in the outbuilding until the perimeter is resealed?" Frances shook her head with quiet authority. "Keep them in the carriage house under 2-man watch. The estate's internal power isn't fully restored, and I don't want unauthorized traffic crossing the main corridor until the forensic sweep is finished. No one interrogates them until I review their gear." "Copy that," Dante said, nodding firmly before barking the order to his men. Marino stood 10 feet away, leaning against the splintered banister with a lit cigar between his fingers, watching the entire scene unfold in silence. His top enforcers, hardened men who had killed for him without a second thought, weren't looking to him for next steps. They were waiting on Frances's word, seeking her tactical sign-off before a single door was opened or a single prisoner was moved. Marino took a slow pull from his cigar, the ember glowing bright in the dim hall. 3 days ago, she had knelt in his driveway asking for a scrap of bread and a cot in the damp cellar. Now, in the smoldering ruins of his greatest victory, his entire syndicate moved only when she said the word. Before we see what Frances earns for all of this, I just want to say thank you for sticking with her story all the way through. This channel is built for people who love watching someone rise from nothing, and if that's you, you're already exactly where you belong. Now let's give her the ending she's earned. By midday, the shattered glass had been swept from the foyer, and the scent of cordite was replaced by the crisp aroma of cedar and fresh espresso. Teresa, the head housekeeper who had once tossed a pair of stiff gray aprons onto a damp cot, now carried a garment bag of tailored dark wool suits and crisp Italian silk into the master guest suite on the 3rd floor. The room overlooked the valley, complete with panoramic reinforced windows, private comms consoles, and an adjoining office that held full authority over the estate's security grid. Frances stood at the window, freshly dressed in a fitted charcoal suit that felt like armor she had worn in another life. Her boots were polished, her dark hair combed back, and the hollow exhaustion that had shadowed her jaw 3 days ago was replaced by the razor-sharp edge of a commander in her element. A knock broke the quiet. Marino stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He carried no weapons, only a leather-bound folder embossed with the Gallo family crest. He crossed the room and laid it on the heavy oak desk between them. "The 3-day trial is finished," Marino said, his voice deep, gravelly, and steady. "Your room in the cellar is cleared. If you want to take a car and disappear with enough cash to start fresh anywhere in the world, the gates are open." Frances didn't touch the folder yet. "And what's in the ledger?" "An exclusive contract," Marino answered, leaning his knuckles against the desk, his tattooed neck and hands catching the afternoon light. "Chief of Tactical Operations and Strategic Intelligence for the entire Gallo syndicate. You dictate our supply lines, our defense grids, our route security, and our perimeter sweeps. My lieutenants report their operational moves to you. You answer only to me." Frances looked at him, her dark eyes reading the intention behind his words with practiced precision. "You know the heat I bring, Marino," she said quietly. The people who framed me in Berlin aren't street thugs. If they pick up my trail, they bring federal assets and black ops fire. A slow, dangerous smile pulled at the corner of Marino's mouth. Let them come, he said softly. They'll find an army waiting behind a wall you built. You needed food and a bed to sleep. Now, I'm offering you an empire to run. Francis opened the folder. The terms were exact, the compensation sovereign, and the authority absolute. She picked up the heavy steel pen from the desk, signing her name across the final line without a moment's hesitation. As she set the pen down, Marino offered his hand. Francis took it in a firm, unbroken grip, a sealed pact between the underworld's deadliest don and the strategist who had rewritten his survival. The drifter in rags was gone. The right hand of the Gallo Empire had taken her seat.